welcome to this edition of Border Report Live. My name is Rudy Mireles, and I'm your host here in Harlingen, Texas, in the Rio Grande Valley of deep South Texas. We've got a packed program lined up for you today. Both our South Texas correspondent, Sandra Sanchez, and our San Diego correspondent, Salvador Rivera, are going to be joining us to talk about an issue that could impact Americans across the country. And we are talking about the screwworm threat that has now gotten much closer to our kitchen table. So we'll talk to them in just a little bit. But first, as always, we're going to start today's program by taking a look at what's trending across the border. A medical plane from Mexico that crashed off the Texas coast on Monday, killing at least 5 people, lost communication with air traffic controllers about 10 minutes prior to that crash. That is according to Mexico's President Claudia Sheinbaum. Authorities initially believed the plane had landed safely at its destination in Galveston, that's near Houston, Texas, before learning it had gone down, Sheinbaum said. 4 of the 8 people aboard were Mexican Navy officers and 4 were civilians, including a child. 2 of the passengers were affiliated with a nonprofit that helps transport Mexican children with severe burns to a hospital in Galveston. Sky Decker, who lives a mile away from where the crash happened, was on a boat ride with his son and neighbor when he heard about the accident. When he arrived at the wreckage, he jumped in the water to help.
I was able to get one woman out that was alive, and then one man that had already passed away.
So what was she saying when you were helping her?
She wasn't saying much. She was in a lot of pain. I think she was really banged up. Both of her legs were broken, and she was asking about the baby, but I didn't know about the baby. So, and she only spoke Spanish. Luckily, I speak Spanish, so I was able to communicate with her. So.
Decker's 11-year-old son taped that rescue. He said his main goal was just to get some video footage to help out police. The cause of the crash is still under investigation, but we have learned of reports of heavy fog blanketed the area at the time of the crash. The U.S. military says it took out yet another boat it said was smuggling drugs in the eastern Pacific Ocean, this time killing 1 person. A video appears to show a number of strikes landing near and on the boat before it finally catches fire. Southern Command provided no evidence that the vessel was actually engaged in drug smuggling. At least 105 people have been killed in 29 known strikes since early September. In other news, China has announced provisional tariffs up to 42.7% on dairy products imported from the European Union that begin today. China's Commerce Ministry said the new duties followed an investigation into EU subsidies for dairy products. The probe was part of China's response to the EU's tariffs on Chinese-made electric vehicles. The elevated duties on EU dairy products will take effect beginning today and will apply to various dairy products, including cheese and milk. And while those tariffs won't have an impact on the dairy here in the United States, one issue that could significantly impact beef prices here is the issue of the screwworm. We've been talking about it for several months now. And today, our Salvador Rivera and Sandra Sanchez are looking at the problem and how it could impact both Texas and California. We're going to get to Sal a little bit later, but let's go ahead and start with you, Sandra, on what is happening here. Tell us what you know so far today.
Yeah, well, Rudy, recently the federal government started a website called screwworm.gov, and you can actually monitor the whereabouts of the screwworm in real time. And this is really important for those of us here on the border who are tracking it, the cattle industry, and all across the southwest border. There's a map actually from that shows the active as well as the number of cases that have come, Mexico, have hit Mexico. And as you can see, it's a little small there, but let me pull it up for you. Chiapas has had 5,148 cases, nearly 2,000 in Oaxaca, and currently there are 243 active cases there. So southern Mexico still getting hit hard, as well as Veracruz nearby. There has 281 active cases right now. They've had about 1,700 cases in total. The other states, Tabasco only has 30 active cases. Yucatan has had almost 1,400 cases, but only 89 active. So kind of controlling it to the southern area there. The closest it has gotten to the border still is in Sabina Hidalgo, which is in the state of Nuevo León, where there's only been 3 total cases, none active right now. So, the United States has really been monitoring this. They have been quarantining and doing preventative measures for any cattle that have shown up with any infections or any of these sores. As you know, the screwworm is actually a fly, and it puts its larva in infections. It actually looks for infected animals, and it can put its larva in pets, in dogs, cats, cattle, even people. And it can actually kill within 2 weeks cattle and pets. So what we're doing here in South Texas, 100 million sterilized screwworm flies are being flown out of a air base here, Moore Air Base in Edinburgh, just a few miles from where we are. And they're going to Panama and South Mexico, and they're trying to help fight the eradication. Sal will talk a little bit more about the proclivities of the screwworm later, but hopefully when construction is completed at the base, they'll have 300 million flies flown out of there, and that should be next year. All of the ports still remain closed to livestock as a preventative measure, and the estimated losses to the Texas cattle industry, if it were to come here, $2.1 billion. So the United States has, taking all precaution measures that it can to try to stop it. There are traps, there are inspectors all along the border. They did just last week approve a drug to treat dogs who may be infected. Again, no screwworm has been known to cross the border, but it has been approved by the FDA conditionally, and that is called Credelio Quattro for dogs. It sounds similar to the drug that just in late November was approved for cats. It's called Credelio Cat. So, holding steady, and it looks like it's contained to southern Mexico, the majority of the cases right now.
So just to clarify, these are treatments, right? So it's only good once your dog or your cat or whatever your animal may be
is infected.
So nothing preventative quite yet.
No. And what they're doing as far as preventative measures is if they find an animal that shows symptoms, they're quarantining, and then they're quarantining the flock that they were with, and they are alerting the United States government and nearby ranches. And it looks like Mexico is really working hard to control and contain, and nobody wants the screwworm to cross the border.
This drug sounds like a much better option compared to what farmers that you actually spoke to months ago said they had to deal with when they dealt with the screwworm back in the
in the
50s?
50s and the 60s, they had to burn the sores or put tar into the sores. Each and every sore, it could take them, weeks to treat an animal who would eventually die, they tell me. And it was just a very sad situation.
Well, not only is that sad for the animal having to deal with all that pain that goes through that treatment, but the dangers that a person has to go through to, effect that treatment sound pretty bad too.
Yes, absolutely.
So, it's definitely something that's very concerning. Luckily, there are people working on it, and it's actually very promising. I don't think 6 months ago when we started talking about this, we had ever really thought about our pets being something that could catch this as well. We were so focused on the livestock, so it's good to see that these treatments seem to be developing at a rapid pace. But I guess that kind of goes to show how bad this could be for the U.S. as a whole if it comes to America.
Yes, and again, screwworm.gov has real time, and you can go there every day, and it will just update you with maps and let you know what's going on. But our reporter Sal in California actually has been digging into what that state is doing to try to prevent it from crossing that border.
Yeah, and that's what we're going to talk about next after a quick break. Salvador Rivera, San Diego correspondent, is going to join us to talk about the work that's going on to combat that screwworm from making its way north. So stay with us. Border Report Live is back in 2 minutes. Welcome back to this edition of Border Report Live. My name is Rudy Mireles here in the Rio Grande Valley of deep South Texas. Time now to bring in our San Diego correspondent, Salvador Rivera, to continue our continuing coverage of the screwworm threat. Sal, you've been following several developments over in your area of responsibility. Fill us in, sir.
Well, Rudy, the fly may not be, or the screwworm may not be in the United States, but it's certainly affecting a lot of people here. I, for example, love to grill meat. And I've been going to my butcher shop to get my favorite cuts of meat, and I've seen the prices steadily increase over the last 6 to 8 months. So it is having an impact north of the border. And as Sandra stated, the screwworm is not really a worm, it's more of a fly. In fact, it is a shiny metallic blowfly. Most of these blowflies are harmless. In fact, they help in the decomposing of dead animals. But this particular fly, the screwworm, actually lives off of living flesh, and that's why it has become a problem. Now, we know that the screwworm was in California all the way to Florida in the late 1800s, all the way into the mid 1900s. Scientists developed a technique of releasing sterile flies to pretty much eradicate the species. Now, researchers are continuing their work. In fact, we have prepared a story to show you what scientists in Southern California are doing to not only prevent the spread of the screwworm, but to educate the public on the dangers of this particular fly.
Including these cows near Santa Paula, California, there are about 2.4 million cows in the state.
California, we're the #1 dairy producing state. We're #4 in beef cattle.
Alec Gary is a professor of veterinary entomology at the University of California, Riverside, where extensive research is going on trying to prevent a screwworm infestation from devastating the cattle industry in California and other states such as Texas.
Screwworm actually refers to the immature forms of the fly, the larva of the fly, or the maggot, if you will. And this particular fly, it's an invasive pest, so it doesn't belong in the United States.
The fly has been found in cows 70 miles south of the border, and that's why the U.S. Department of Agriculture is keeping cattle from Mexico out of the U.S.
These flies tend to find wounds on animals, and it's in those wounds that they lay their eggs. And so these flies have found cattle to be one of the hosts that they can often infest to great economic cost for our animal producers, who then have to treat the animal, or in some cases have to put the animal down because the infestation is too severe for the animal. So if you bring animals from one location and they're infested with these maggots already in a wound and you don't realize it, you move them to another location, eventually those maggots will finish their development and they'll become adult flies in this new region. So of course we're trying to prevent that.
The screwworm can take hold in all sorts of animals, not just cattle, but horses, dogs, anything with an open sore.
And they actually eat the living tissue of those animals, enlarging the wounds and oftentimes resulting eventually in the death of the animal.
During the first half of the 1900s, the screwworm was prevalent in cows from California all the way to Florida. They got rid of the pest by releasing millions of sterile flies into the air.
By 1966, California was one of the last states the fly was eradicated from. By the 1990s, they actually drove the population all the way down south of Panama. Unfortunately, in 2023, the flies escaped northward of that barrier zone, and they've been moving north through Central America and up into Mexico, creating concern again that the flies might once again reach the United States.
Gary says he and fellow scientists at UC Riverside are gearing up to begin surveillance programs looking for the flies in California. They will also be working with the U.S. Department of Agriculture to update education and pest management materials that haven't been upgraded in 60 years.
The images of those cows, the cattle, were taken up in Santa Paula, California. And if you're not familiar with California, and I bet most of you are not, it is north of Los Angeles in Ventura County. The owner of that property, the owner of those cows, was telling us that he has heard of the screwworm, is concerned, but not overly concerned. He's confident that the government will do its best to keep it out of the United States. In fact, he agreed completely with the measure of keeping cattle from Mexico from being exported into the United States. And again, he said for now he feels fairly confident that the screwworm will not reach California or other parts along the southern border. Now, I wanted you to hear a little bit more from Professor Alec Gary, who was telling us about this education programs, and get set to hear from him to describing when they're about to do this and what they have in store for the general public and for people who raise cattle.
We're working a lot with federal partners, with the U.S. Department of Agriculture in particular on this project, and the expectation is that we're going to be developing educational materials and extension materials, materials to help animal producers and veterinarians to manage these screwworms should they arrive. We're going to do this in a way that matches what is going on in other states and in the federal government to ensure that we're following basically a process that will work for the whole U.S. So we have a lot of partners in this project, and we're really looking forward to the opportunity to work with those partners and develop these products and hopefully prepare for what could be the worst outcome, which is that the flies actually do arrive in the U.S., though of course we hope that they never do. The project is a 3-year project, so we're going to begin developing these materials right away. The project technically starts in January of 2026, so we'll have an advisory board or a working group that we're going to start initially, starting in January, and then I expect that those products, those educational materials and extension materials, will start to come out late in 2026.
And this research, this work is being funded by a grant from the California Department of Food and Agriculture. In fact, they've received already well over $500,000, and they expect to be in areas like San Diego in March doing research, trying to figure out if the fly has come to this part of California. And again, all this project is supposed to take place during the course of 2026. And as Sandra stated, the fear is, of course, that this could be devastating for the cattle industry, the dairy producing ranchers all across Texas and California, all over the country, because as Dr. Gary was saying, we have already seen the screwworm in this country from the late 1800s all the way into the 1960s. It was very prevalent in this country. So there's a lot of concern, but luckily there is a lot of work, a lot of stuff that is happening to prevent the screwworm from taking hold north of the border.
Well, it's interesting that you kind of ended with that, because it's kind of what Sandra and I were talking about. I think it's very promising, right? That we've seen already treatments available for house pets, and we're seeing these teams like that professor that you spoke with going in and already working on something to get it out in the next couple of years. But I assume that kind of means they're pretty hopeful about it working too.
They certainly are very positive about their work and what they are going to do. Keep in mind, Rudy, that also Mexico is doing a lot. It has opened a big lab, or in fact, it has refurbished a lab in southern Mexico. It is investing about $50 million. The U.S. is also putting up some of that money to come up with the sterile flies to be released in southern Mexico. And again, as Professor Gary said, at one point, they were able to push the fly all the way into Panama, but something happened a couple of years ago that it got out of the labs or out of the area and made its way north of the border. I think I remember Sandra telling me a story that this happened during COVID, where personnel was not involved, not working at the facility. They sort of kept their eye off of the ball, and some of the flies were smart enough to get out of there, and that's how they began migrating north to Central America, and then into southern Mexico.
That's exactly what I've been told by scientists. That's what happened. Inspectors weren't allowed to go to some of the facilities where they were creating the sterilized screwworms, flies during COVID, and so that's how they got out. And as you know, these screwworms actually, the female only mates with one male, and so that's why if you release a sterilized screwworm male, then that's how it is eradicating the population. It's a really interesting study of science that we've been learning. Some of that video I did want to point out I took of the cow drinking the Rio Grande. That is on the Mexican side. So we do have the concern of some cows that just walk up to the river. And, if we do have some infected cows, there is a concern by ranchers on this side. Well, who's watching them? They're just walking around. And, if they're infected, the fly could just cross the river. So we are keeping our eyes on it.
And we talk about the billions of dollars that are at stake here when we're talking about our cattle industry here in the United States. But I think another thing for folks at home to kind of take away from this is look at the binational cooperation happening and the amount of binational funding that's going into this. I mean, this is a serious threat, and it may not seem like it because it's just a little fly, but it's definitely something that, both countries are incredibly concerned about. And as well as you just said, Sandra, our ranchers all along the border. are, when they see these cows just on the other side of the Rio Grande, they're thinking, is this the one that's going to, run me out of business? Is this the one that's going to shut down my operation for the year? So, for the folks at home that may not be quite grasping the gravity of this situation, I think those facts should help you understand it a little better. Well, that we're going to continue this coverage, obviously, as things develop over the coming months and maybe even years as these programs develop out on your side of the border, Salvador. But we appreciate you being here today. Salvador Rivera, our San Diego correspondent, Sandra Sanchez, our South Texas correspondent. Stay with us. Sandra's going to come back. She's got some new reporting to tell us about. So Border Report Live will be back in 2 minutes. Welcome back to this edition of Border Report Live. Rudy Mideles here in Harlingen, Texas. Joining me today, South Texas correspondent Sandra Sanchez. Sandra, you've got some new reporting on H-1B visas. Fill us in.
Yeah, actually, we started to hear of some foreign workers, H-1B. These are very high-skilled workers who return to their home countries to try to get the visas renewed as is required. And then they were told that their appointments were canceled, postponed for several months. Well, it turns out today, U.S. Citizenship Immigration Services confirmed that there are stricter vetting measures that are being put in place. And actually, a friend of one of my children called from India and said that she works for a high-tech company, that she's stranded in her home country as she went there for a December 15th meeting. It turns out that was the first day that they started this stricter vetting process. They're trying to look into their social media accounts, and it applies to those with H-1B visas as well as those with H-4 visas. Now, H-4 visas are foreigners who are dependents of those of H-1B visas, so who might be here as a child under age 21 or a spouse. And so the Trump administration is trying to look at social media accounts and make sure that the people are not showing any threat to society or even overstating what their job title might be on LinkedIn, for instance. The embassy in India posted on X that this week that it started this online presence of reviews for all of its H-1B and H-4 visa applicants in a bid to, quote, curb abuse of the H-1B program. And so today, USCIS spokesman Matthew Trageser issued this quote. He said, quote, the existing random selection process of H-1B registrations was exploited and abused by U.S. employers who were primarily seeking to import foreign workers at lower wages than they would pay American workers. So this has started, and unfortunately, some of the high-tech firms are saying that to their workers, don't leave, don't go to your home country. 70% of the H-1B workers come from India, and the top 5 companies for these H-1B visa employers, according to USCIS, is Amazon, Meta, Microsoft, Tata Consultancy Services, and Google. So some really popular companies there who are suddenly losing their workers who, in the case of my son's friend, has an appointment in March. Some are given appointments in April. USCIS told us some have been pushed back to August.
It's very interesting because just a couple weeks ago, President Trump came under fire by his side of the aisle in Congress for saying something along the lines of, we need a lot of these people to come in because there aren't enough Americans to do these tech jobs at very high levels. Do we know what the reversal was in this case?
Well, all of these stricter measures came into place after the shooting of the National Guard members over Thanksgiving weekend, and they have just come out. Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem, the Trump administration, has said, we're going to vet people who are in our country more, students, workers, everyone. And they've stopped asylum applications. So this is just a part of that process. In addition, today we learned that they are going, because the administration has said that the random selection for these H-1B program has been, quote, allowing unscrupulous employers to exploit it and flood the selection pool with lower skilled foreign workers. So they put these new rules in process. Now they are also now putting in a new tougher scrutiny for how you could get an H-1B visa. And these rules are going to take effect in February 27th, and it will be through 2027. And they say that it'll be a weighted selection process that will increase the probability that higher skilled workers are actually going to get the visas. They're saying that they want more higher skilled workers and those that they are certain do not pose a threat to national security or might have overstated who they are or misstated some of their past history.
All right. Well, thank you so much for all of your reporting today, Sandra. We appreciate you being here. South Texas correspondent Sandra Sanchez joining us this afternoon. And before we go, just wanted to remind you real quick that you can get Border Report Live in podcast form. We're available on Apple Podcasts, the iHeartRadio app, Spotify, and both video and audio versions of the program on YouTube. So make sure to check it out today. For Sandra Sanchez here in South Texas, Salvador Rivera in San Diego, my name is Rudy Mireles. We'll see y'all next time.